Well, we might come back to that tricky question at the end, but on this question of migration, it seems to me that the number and the scale of the migration is a crucial element. In Australia in the 50s and 60s, the number of migrants from southern European nations was relatively small to the extent that you couldn't make a living just by speaking Italian or speaking Greek. You had to learn English, you had to go out into the wider economy. And that's true, I think, in Finland. I noticed I had a taxi driver on my first day, an Iraqi refugee, been there 12 years. He'd learnt English, Swedish and Finnish. That's how dedicated he was to fitting in. And that's exactly what you say. It's the kind of migrant who wants to get on and fit in. But in Malmo, at the other end of Sweden, where you've got large numbers of migrants from the Middle East, people are saying that it could be the first Muslim city in Europe. I don't know. I'll be travelling to Malmo later and I'll bring you a report from there for next week's programme. But that's the problem, isn't it? When you bring in a lot of people and they're able to exist within a society within a society, then you've got real division problems. And that, I sense we're on the cusp of that in Australia.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we're on the cusp of it. And it's important to say we're on the cusp of it because I don't think we've tipped over, sort of gone over the tipping point, like, for example, England and Scotland and France and maybe even Germany and maybe Belgium, possibly the Netherlands. Some of those countries or all of those countries probably have, and they're going to have, they're having really serious problems now, and I can only foresee those problems getting worse, especially as things in the Middle East continue to heat up, and we've spoken about that in the past. But yeah, I think you're right. I think Australia's on the cusp of a point where we've started where we've pursued a very irresponsible immigration problem for so long that we kind of lose any ability to be able to generate a cultural homogeneity from this point on. I don't know that we're at the tipping point yet. I don't know that we've gone over the tipping point. We may not have. I suspect we haven't yet, which is really good news because it just means that in Australia, if you've got enough courage in Canberra and in state parliaments to have an education system that emphasises, a unity in Australia, that emphasises the really great things about Australia, then maybe over the next 30 years, we'll actually wind up being more socially unified than we have been over the last 30 years. So, but yeah, certainly we have had a very irresponsible policy.
But we have to be doing something right. In fact, we're probably doing a lot of things right. And here's why, Steve. If a migrant is somebody who was born overseas, that accounts for more than 30% of the population in Australia, more than 3 in 10 of the population, myself included, migrants. Whereas you talk about Germany, you're talking about 16, 17%, Britain about the same. These countries, although they apparently have more problems with integration, they have smaller percentages of migrants overall. So doesn't that say we're doing something right?
Yeah, our system, our policy has definitely worked better than what theirs have over the years. And look, the only thing I can really put that down to, I know it's very politically incorrect to say, but we must be frank. Australia has a much smaller Muslim population than those countries. Our Muslim population, oh gosh, I think last time I looked was around about 3.5%, which is less than half of a lot of those countries. And so I think that actually makes a big difference because the sad truth is that although I think most Muslim immigrants do want to fit in and they're good citizens, the fact is that when you start to create large insular Islamic communities, that's when you start to get social problems. That's when you start to get subgroups of radicalization. And Australia hasn't experienced that as badly yet because specifically our Muslim minorities are actually much smaller than the Muslim minorities in the European countries. If there's one thing that's really bad for immigrants, it's a bad immigration policy. The worst enemy of immigrants is not racist Australians. It's bad immigration policies, because when you have bad immigration policies, unfortunately, all immigrants have to bear the anger of Australians for that policy. So the best thing that Australian immigrants and even Australian Muslims can want is a very responsible, restrained immigration policy that doesn't put strain on the country, that doesn't pull at the social unity in this country, and that gives Australians a positive attitude towards immigration and immigrants in general.
We have, of course, a very diverse population within the Islamic community in Australia. I mean, they come from all over the place, Malaysia, Indonesia, as well as, the Middle East and in different parts of the Middle East, you Sufi, Sunni. But this is what worries me right now, Stephen, is we've seen coalescing around this totem of Palestine, a very hard-line extremist and highly intolerant view arising, which we see on our university campuses, now spreading beyond the Muslim community. We see it in those those horrible scenes in Melbourne last weekend. I'm certain that it does not represent the views of most Muslims in Australia, but as we know, a small, angry elite can pretty soon dominate the agenda, and that's what's happening here. Does it worry you as much as it worries me?
Yeah, it worries me. I mean, I would have to say a few qualifying things. Do I think most Muslims, particularly Muslims from the Arab world in Australia, sort of want to engage in terrorism and want to encourage terrorism? No, I don't. But I can't say that there aren't an awful lot of people in Australia, and I would say Muslims, particularly from the Arab background, who are quite sympathetic with a lot of the extremist language of these protests. And I've seen it myself. I grew up in Bankstown, which is one of the most multicultural cities in Australia. I saw Jew hatred when I was in year 12 at high school, when I went to high school at a Bankstown public school. It was there. We studied the Arab-Israeli conflict. And most of my cohort were students from the Middle East. They hated Jews. They would say it, that they hate Jews. So none of this is very surprising to me. I mean, again, I was in Bankstown. I was in that region when 9/11 happened. And there were very wide reports amongst those living in areas like Punchbowl and Lakemba that there was dancing in the streets when that took place. When I posted something on Facebook about a month ago on the stabbing of the Syrian bishop in a church near Liverpool, and I said, this was an Islamic terror act. One of my Facebook followers wrote and said, "Hey, just reminding you, he did insult our prophet." So essentially, what she was saying was he got what was coming to him. I could actually give you other anecdotes from my friends who directly encountered this. And so I'm sorry to say that although it's not the case that the overwhelming majority of Arab Muslims in Australia want to engage in acts of terrorism or would directly support that kind of thing, I don't think I can say that I can't say that a large number of them aren't very sympathetic to a lot of the extremist language that is taking place. Here's the thing, Nick. 2 months after the October 7th massacre, throughout Palestine, a survey was taken, and this was publicized widely in the news, in Associated Press, in Reuters. 72% of Palestinians agree with the actions of Hamas on October 7th. 82% of Palestinians in the West Bank agreed with those actions. Labor has brought over, I think, something like 2,000 Palestinians on temporary visas. I think a quarter of them are applying for permanent visas, or 2,000 are applying for permanent visas. I can't remember the exact number. So, we've got some serious problems in Australia, and if things in the Middle East get worse, things here could get pretty bad.
Well, yeah, I mean, we want to see firmer, stronger resolve from our politicians in particular, but from all people in authority, police chiefs, to just say, there's a rule. There's a very simple rule. Everybody is welcome in Australia, providing they come through legal means, but you leave your troubles at the door. We don't want to import the bitterness and hatred for the Middle East into Australia. Where you leave those things behind. You are Australian when you come. Isn't that? Am I being, I don't know, Pollyanna-ish about this?
Well, I think it's Pollyanna-ish, because what we're seeing now is that when things are good in the Middle East, the gripes are sort of not a big issue. But when things go bad in the Middle East, no, the hostilities come with them. And these are very, very deep hostilities. They are really deep. They go back hundreds, thousands of years. And to say to people, leave it at the door when you come here, for a lot of people, these hostilities are just part of who they are. For a lot of them, it is part of what Islam is. And anyone who reads the Quran will see that when Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for them, you don't get that in the Quran. You get a very different message. And part of the problem is that for years, universities have, in their own way, been stoking these kinds of animosities by being vehemently anti-Israel in units that teach about Middle Eastern conflict and things like that, hiring just Israel haters onto departments, and not hiring Israel defenders in departments. And so when you do a course in political science or a course in international relations, you're never going to come across a view of the Arab-Israeli conflict that has sympathy for Israel. And so sadly, we're in a situation now in the universities where the university campuses now are being taken over. It's happening in Melbourne right now, by students who detest Israel, many of whom just detest Jews, and who are almost inciting violence in the language that they use, chanting intifada, and the universities are basically doing nothing about it. So what we're seeing is that there are deep social fissures in Australia that are that are coming to light. Exactly what to do about it is a very difficult question. What I do think we need to do is rethink this whole idea that anyone from anywhere is welcome in Australia as long as they pledge some sort of allegiance to Australian values. I think we're finding that's a pretty naive idea. It worked when you were dealing with Christian and Jewish Europeans after World War II. It seems to work for the most part with Asian Australians, from what I can tell. When you're dealing with conflicts and hatreds as deep and long-lasting as those that we see in the Middle East, it doesn't seem to be working as well. And I'm not calling for a ban on Islamic immigration. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying, we do need to actually think about the kinds of cultural communities that are developing in Australia based on our current immigration policy, and ask ourselves, do we want to grow those communities any larger?
Well, that's certainly a very live debate here in Europe, in Sweden, in Germany, in Holland, where the European elections will shortly be conducted. We'll be bringing you more on that on Reality Bites in forthcoming weeks. But in the meantime, Stephen, thank you for joining us on Reality Bites.
Thanks, Nick. Have a great time in Europe.